My name is Edgar Mannheimer, and this is Kalam, a podcast about the Middle East.
But the police came and they arrested us for trespassing, which is really surreal because how can you be trespassing if you're standing where you work? So it was also very bizarre that space, which for the last 19 years now is, in my memory, is linked to being arrested by the police, and not any police, something called the Special Response Unit, which was founded in 2015, which specializes in counterterrorism and political dissent, and in its notorious history has committed many human rights violations.
That was the Iraqi writer, poet, and literary scholar Sinan Antoon, who we'll be getting back to in just a second. But first, I'd like to say a few words about the urgent situation on the ground in Gaza. Earlier this week, Hamas agreed to an Egyptian-brokered ceasefire deal in a last-ditch attempt to prevent Israel from going through with their offensive on Rafah. This despite the fact that Israel had pledged it would be invading Rafah regardless of a ceasefire deal, which strikes me as a completely ludicrous negotiating platform. It's the equivalent of Hamas saying it would keep firing rockets at Israel irrespective of a ceasefire agreement. But Hamas did accept. Gazans celebrated, and the world held its breath. It didn't take long, however, before we received the devastating news that Netanyahu and the fascist elements of his government rejected the deal. The invasion of Rafah began with bombings and tanks rolling in. Hundreds of thousands of Gazans have already now been displaced yet again, probably the fifth or sixth time for many families. Netanyahu needs this war to continue for many reasons, many of them personal to him. The US, it seems, will not live up to its red line threats and will denounce Israel's invasion, but will let it happen in the end. What happens next is totally unpredictable, and frankly, it's terrifying. We will be following these events closely on Kalam. But first, a reminder. If you like this podcast, please give us a rating in whatever podcast application you're listening to right now. Please also subscribe to us in order to get new episodes directly into your podcast feed. These actions will also help other people find out about us. And if you want to support independent, in-depth, and professional journalism about the Middle East and Palestine, you can do so by joining our Patreon community. For just $3 a month, you'll receive full-length interviews and lots of bonus material. Find us at patreon.com/kalampodcast. Now, on to the show.
Extremely prepared. Let's talk about Columbia. Let's talk about Hamilton Hall, right? A book on terrorism.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And I've said it before, that there's somebody, whether it's paid, not paid, but they are radicalizing our students.
This is the bizarre and extremely American moment when NYPD and aspiring influencer Kaz Daughtry goes on the far-right news channel Newsmax, holding up an Oxford University textbook introduction to the concept of terrorism, written by renowned British historian Charles Townsend, as if it were evidence. Officer Daughtry waves this university textbook, while the Newsmax anchors gasp and clutch their pearls, as if we're all supposed to understand that this is somehow evidence of so-called outside agitators trying to incite U.S. students to terrorist violence? This is so beyond McCarthyist satire that I won't even dignify it with a rebuttal, but it is a helpful indicator of where American and indeed Western society is right now. The Gaza Solidarity Encampment movement in the US is truly inspiring and crucially important, since the US is the only country in the world that has the power to influence Israel. So to influence the US at this point is a matter of life and death when it comes to the people of Gaza. But the heavy-handed approach of the US authorities has shocked many people around the world. In the name of protecting Jewish students, I have seen Israeli-trained riot police brutally beat down and handcuff a 65-year-old professor of Jewish studies, Annalise Orlick, simply for protesting against Israel's war in Gaza. I mean, this is insanity.
I was mad because they had taken my phone, and I was mad because they just body slammed me and it hurt. And so I went, I said, give me back my phone, that I'm trying to get my phone back. I did, and at that moment, 3 police lifted me up in the air, slammed me down onto the ground. I mean, threw me down onto the ground on my bad shoulder. They said I was resisting arrest.
Video captured by News 9 shows the moment Dartmouth College professor Annalise Orlick was arrested by police during last night's protest.
Many university administrations have invited police to deal with students who support Palestine, and we've all been seeing scenes, from UCLA that remind me personally of the Arab uprisings in 2011, where police are firing, rubber bullets onto students. University administrations invite these heavily armed, essentially mini armies onto campus because they do not answer to the students that they allegedly serve. Instead, they answer to the billionaire donors who fund these for-profit universities across the United States. And many of these donors are deeply implicated in the U.S. military-industrial complex and have financial stakes in U.S. and Israeli security systems. This is obviously deeply problematic and emblematic of U.S. corruption. And to speak about all of this, I'm so honored that today we have the Iraqi writer, poet, and literary scholar Sinan Antoon to walk us through our current paradigm. He's an associate professor at NYU in New York City and was arrested 2 weeks ago for protesting for Palestine. Listen to our conversation after just a few bars I wanted to share with you from the Palestinian electro debkit group 47 Soul.
وانا ما بتفرق عندي يا حلوة يا اهلك بنوان الجليلة ومن نخر ولا من صحراء العرب I don't care where you're from, where you're from I don't care where you're from, where you're from كنت من اهل البلد ولا سكنتوا بالغلط I don't care where you're from, where you're from I don't care where you're from
Sinan Antoon, thank you for your writing and your poetry and your scholarly work and for taking a stand in this historic, ongoing student movement in the US, and welcome to the Kalam podcast.
Thank you for having me. Very delighted to be here.
So before we get into the larger picture of this pro-Palestine student movement, I just want you to tell us about your personal case. You were briefly detained about a week or so ago while staging a peaceful protest at NYU, where you're an assistant professor, if I'm not mistaken. Could you walk us through what happened and what kind of repercussions, if any, you've faced since?
Sure. Associate professor.
Associate professor. What did I say?
Took a lot of work.
Yeah, of course.
Sure. The students established an encampment, and I am part of Faculty for Justice in Palestine, which now has become Faculty and Staff for Justice in Palestine, which was primarily founded to support our students because since October, they've been systematically muffled and censored by the university, which is shutting down any space where pro-Palestine speech can be expressed, changing the guidelines, and punishing a lot of students for simply expressing their opinion. So they decided to have an encampment. And as usual with these events that they organize or we organize, we go there to support them, to show them, to be with them, to document, to observe, and to mediate when the usually campus security come and usually NYPD, the New York Police Department, comes. And they had started in the morning, and as soon as they started their encampment, the campus security asked them to leave because there's this very murky category of public-private space.
Yeah.
So that anyway, but everything was, to be honest with you, it was a very amazing atmosphere. I mean, there were protests for Gaza to end the genocide, for ceasefire, but also to divest from Israel and to disclose the investments of the university in weapons manufacturing and to shut down NYU Tel Aviv because it actually violates the university's mission, because NYU Tel Aviv, like so many other places, are not open to all of the inhabitants of Palestine.
Yeah.
And as soon as the encampment was put in place, the campus security came and put in barriers around it, which is another violation, to be honest with you. It's kind of like an Israeli approach, putting barriers, restricting space. But they put up barriers so that students and professors who want to join, because it's a plaza, wouldn't be able to go in. And they established this system whereby, so when I went there after my class, they said, oh, someone has to leave for you to go in. And there were a lot of students on the sidewalk who wanted to join, but the campus security would not let them in. And at one point, they all showed their IDs, and 5 or 6 of them just removed the barrier and went in. Now, later, the university will categorize this as the breach. And as many of us have been commenting, just like authoritarian regimes, this notion that outside agitators came in, blah, blah, blah. But the atmosphere was jovial. The students and professors really they represent the spectrum. There are people of all faiths and all backgrounds. And it was such a safe atmosphere that one of the professors, who's Jewish, brought his kids to play around.
Yeah.
But the university leadership never really bothered since October to communicate with any of these students or with the faculty. And, the president or someone else could have come down to talk to them, take their demands seriously, but they didn't. So then we saw that there were police cars surrounding the area, and I was taking a break, but we received messages to come for support because the police were about to attack.
Yeah.
So we professors stood next to each other with 2 rows, but the police came and they arrested us for trespassing, which is really surreal, because how can you be trespassing if you're standing where you work?
Yeah.
It's actually the place I take to go back home from my office or from teaching. So it was also very bizarre that space, which for the last 19 years, now is, in my memory, is linked to being arrested by the police, and not any police, something called the Special Response Unit, which was founded in 2015, which specializes in counterterrorism and political dissent, and in its notorious history has committed many human rights violations, according to Human Rights Watch, against American activists, people who protested in Black Lives Matter. And we were taken to the police station and processed and released after 3-4 hours. And then 2 days ago, the students started another encampment somewhere else. And of course, a lot of professors and even parents of students sent letters condemning the university for calling in the police in the first time in the university's history. And there are promises that there will never be police again. But 2 days ago, they invited the police at 6 a.m. and they removed the encampment and arrested students. And interestingly enough, since this is a media podcast, Fox News, the notorious right-wing Fox News, was there before the police. So there is coordination between, needless to say, there's coordination between the police, the university administration, and the media, because I'm sure you know now they're portraying these camps as somehow, radical and violent. But of course, it's all lies. But the New York Police Department has its own media outlet.
Yeah.
But they're not very smart, because they found a lot of water in the camp, because a lot of students and professors and people living around here were bringing food and water, and they found water, and they said, "Oh, look, all of this water. This is really
Suspicious.
organized." You're drinking water too.
Yeah. I mean, it's we're gonna get into all of these like kind of Soviet-style pathetic attempts to smear many of the students. But first, I think many people who are going to be listening to this podcast are in Sweden and in places outside the U.S. and everyone's talking about what's happening in the U.S., but there are such conflicting images of what is an encampment. So could you just kind of walk us through from the beginning what it is? Because if you listen to the President of the United States, it seems like it's a threatening mob of students who are preventing other students from going to school and trying to disrupt like classes and stuff like that. So what exactly is an encampment?
No, that's a great question. I mean, there is a model, it seems, but it's just basically all these little tents that students sleep, students who stay overnight. But an encampment is just a place where students congregate, and there are signs listing their demands. There are symbols. But the amazing thing about the encampment at NYU and other encampments, from what I can see, it's a mini university, actually. There are daily programs. There are lectures. There is information. Professors visit and give talks. There are poetry readings. There is music played. There are sometimes films. And to quote some journalist who visited the Columbia encampment after having heard all these statements, he said, "These are just nerds. A lot of them were studying. Some of them were praying." So to me, I mean, to be honest with you, I've been teaching at NYU for 19 years and teaching at universities for 21 years. And I'm often alienated and conflicted about being inside academia. And we all joke about, ways to get out of academia.
Yeah,
this
sure.
movement has restored my faith because
Wow.
we've learned so much from the students also, and how organized they are, how knowledgeable they are. There is a library in every encampment. Our library is named after Rifat al-Arir, the Palestinian academic who was assassinated by Israel.
Yeah.
But of course, I think because also of the maturity of the demands of this movement in a way, and how it is connecting Palestine with the military-industrial complex, with imperialism, with right-wing ideologies, with climate change, it has the potential to grow because it's not just about Palestine, or to quote one of the slogans, Palestine is everywhere, meaning the fight against settler colonialism and rabid capitalism can take place everywhere. And the fact that our university is connected financially to Israel and to weapons factories, and the fact that the New York Police Department has an office in Tel Aviv, and that its officers train with the Israeli army, shows us that all of these things are interconnected.
Yeah.
But to be honest, even our colleagues who are not quote unquote political or even leftist, when they went and visited the encampment and spoke to students, they were really inspired, because it's a place to have conversations. It's a place to discuss issues. A lot of professors started to take their students there because obviously there's a lot of learning and education taking place. And it's also very clean and respectful of the surroundings and whatnot. And so it's like a commune in a way.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are making the obvious comparison to the anti-war movement in the late 60s. In Colombia, I believe that encampment was directly inspired by an encampment organized, I think, in 68 during the anti-war student movement that swept across the Western world at that time. Do you think that's a helpful comparison?
Well, of course. I mean, I always think that, movements always learn from the past and they build on. And it's not a secret that, for example, when the Black Lives Matter movement started, they got a lot of tips on social media from their comrades in Arab countries. So there's all of that. So there's building on of that. But of course, what I think marks this movement is the composition of those who are taking place. It's also, of course, the United States as a country demographically has changed a lot, but also the maturity and the spectrum of demands. There's also similarities to the movement to divest from apartheid South Africa, and the students know about all of these things. That's why some of the people who participated in earlier struggles came back to visit and to support, and then they were, of course, dubbed outside agitators and professional agitators. The Arab revolts and the Arab uprisings and the Occupy Wall Street, although it's of a different type, but Black Lives Matter definitely, because that's in the memory of a lot of these students who were maybe in their, they were in late high school and so on and so forth.
Sure. We've been touching on this and joking a little bit about it. I mean, but since October 7, it's any kind of show of solidarity with Gaza or Palestinians or the Palestinian issue has been met with accusations of anti-Semitism, and this current student movement is definitely being accused, at least by the U.S. right and the united right across the Western world, of being rife with anti-Semitism, and obviously putting aside the fact that many of these student encampments are led by Jewish students and Jewish professors. What's your take? What is this accusation? Is there any kind of merit to it?
Not to minimize or ever belittle anti-Semitism or any kind of phobia or racism, which obviously we're all against. But considering it's this whole, movement, if we can call it, that started from October until today, and how many incidents have there been? There hasn't been really a single assault or a single actual by the protesters. It's the other way around, actually. I'm sure many people will see that for UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles, the other side, the Zionists attacked brutally and destroyed, and they were financed by some of the same donors who want to change universities. But as you mentioned, and I couldn't emphasize this more, whether in the Faculty for Justice in Palestine, or Students for Justice in Palestine, or the encampment, or the protests, Jewish colleagues and Jewish students are overrepresented. Meaning they are much more than their percentage. Exactly. And this is the major shift, particularly in the United States, in that this generation of young Jewish Americans are no longer necessarily pro-Israel automatically, and cannot be, counted on by Zionist organizations. So this is the last weapon that the Zionists and the anti-Palestinian forces have, is to distract. By using anti-Semitism, it distracts from what is actually happening on the ground as we speak now, which is a genocide. This movement is calling for the end of a genocide. And of course, because these students, and we can't end the genocide, all we can do is pressure our universities and so on and so forth. And I want to give an example also of the last Monday when we had this encampment. There was a Jewish prayer, and then there was a Muslim prayer. And just 2 days ago, the same thing. There are many signs that say Jews for Palestine. Here in the United States, we have several organizations. We have Jewish Voices for Peace. On campus, we have Jews Against Zionism. And I urge listeners to go and look. There is a long history of anti-Zionism, which actually started by a lot of Jews who did not want to become hostages to a rabid nationalism. So for me personally, the most eloquent anti-Zionist voices and arguments I've heard are from Jewish writers and Jewish thinkers, and from Jewish friends and colleagues who don't want to be just a pawn for Israel. And it's actually, we don't have time to get into that, it's anti-Semitic to assume that every Jewish person has to be pro-Israel. Yeah, and also the other serious problem in this country is that the previous President Trump made it into law that the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is adopted.
IHRA stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and was actually founded by the former Swedish Prime Minister Göran Persson. In 2016, it adopted the so-called working definition of anti-Semitism, which many countries have since adopted as their official interpretation of what anti-Semitism is. I believe it is a truly dangerous document because it totally conflates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and more or less calls boycotting Israel anti-Semitic. As Sinan Antoon says, anti-Semitism, a term which is very important and has a very real meaning, could lose its meaning if language is abused in this way.
Even though one of the writers of this IHRA definition himself wrote later, distanced himself to say that, you know, the way that IHRA is being used is not what they had in mind. And there is something much better called the Jerusalem Declaration, which does not, you know, conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
But in response to October 7th and the pressure from a lot of donors, right-wing and Zionist donors, a lot of universities, our university is adopting that, which is going to has already made life difficult for a lot of professors. Some professors who were fired, some who were reprimanded. And so that is a huge problem. And I should note, which you know, of course, and some of the listeners know, the irony is a lot of the right-wing voices in Europe and the United States that are vehemently pro-Israel are themselves anti-Semites.
100%.
So we just have to be very careful about that. But I think the ferocity of the attack against pro-Palestine speech and the student movement is also motivated by the fact that I think it is terrifying to ardent Zionists and to the Israeli government that so many of the student leaders and the participants are Jewish themselves. I mean, it's also unprecedented but Netanyahu opines on how American universities should conduct themselves.
Yeah.
I mean,
this is what the deranged demagogue Netanyahu had to say about the US protests, where Jewish students are greatly overrepresented.
This is reminiscent of what happened in German universities in the 1930s. It's unconscionable. It has to be stopped. It has to be condemned, and condemned unequivocally.
But this is also what a lot of the movement is about, is frankly disentangling the United States from Israel and from Zionism. And, you know, this is a country where the infrastructure has been crumbling, where we have major problems with financing education, where we don't have universal health care. The richest country on earth does not have universal health care. So a lot of the demands are also, why should the United States keep financing Israel with billions and billions of dollars when we in this country as citizens have serious problems?
Yeah.
It's irrational. I mean, it's not irrational, it's ideological.
Of course.
But why should all of this financing go? And most importantly, a lot of the people are just decent people who don't want to be complicit in a genocide.
Yeah.
So that's why, for your listeners, being in the United States means that our tax dollars are financing the Israeli killing machine. So it's different from, of course, all these advanced Western democracies sell weapons to genocide machines. But I'm talking about the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly some of the most famous people, if not, I mean, they're Jewish, but they're also just some of the most famous people in the world were these like early anti-Zionists that you speak of, like Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt. These are not just anyone, you know, but this kind of erasure it's remarkable how successful it's been, considering how popular and well-known a figure like Albert Einstein is. But yeah, and just commenting on the IHRA definition, I think that's one of the most harmful and threatening things when it comes to Jewish people today, because I know all my life I've sort of, when people sometimes conflate Zionism and Judaism, and I've always said, like, there's a difference between Israel and Jews, and not all Jewish people support Israel, not all Jewish people are Zionists. And then this thing comes and just basically says, no, that's actually not true. You know, and it's just adopted by all these Western governments, basically saying that if you criticize or boycott Israel, you're anti-Semitic, which just strikes me as so dangerous and so insane.
It's also trivializing anti-Semitism, frankly, because when you throw this term around and when its definition becomes so expansive that it covers almost anything, it also loses its meaning.
Exactly. Like the word terrorism, for example.
Exactly.
But I think you mentioned a few times the donors who essentially own many universities in the United States, and I wonder if you could, as briefly as you can, walk us through what's happened with American education and why it's possible to crack down on protests like this, because it wasn't always the case that tuition fees were like tens of thousands of dollars. Universities used to be almost free in the United States, as I've understood it. Many of the University of California universities used to be free, and even the Ivy League universities on the East Coast used to be more or less free. I mean, very difficult to get into and elitist and all of that. But now it seems that they're funded by private donors, just a few handful of people, and that if you want to study there, you're going to be paying back student loans for the rest of your life, which individualizes the kind of the way that students would approach critical thinking and criticizing this institution that they owe so much money to.
No, that's a very important point. And you know, maybe the private universities have their endowments and always have, but as you mentioned, the state universities, which used to be very affordable to any citizen, as they should be. You know, as I tell my fellow citizens here and some students that they don't know that education in Germany is free, for example.
Yeah.
But from the 70s, you know, and from the before that, but particularly in the Reagan era when he was the governor of California, this privatization, fighting public support, took so much money away, of course, to lower the taxes of the rich, right?
Yeah.
So you take away the support from all of these institutions and all of these social programs in order to lower the taxes of the rich. So a lot of the universities end up having to seek more private funds from corporations and from donors. And that meant that increasingly those donors had a lot of say as to how the university conducts itself, because of course they can withdraw the money, or a lot of them sit on the board of trustees and board of directors. So for example, at NYU, we have on the board of trustees and board of directors all kinds of right-wing Zionists and people who are implicated in weapons manufacturing. But all of that made, of course, as you said, university tuition so high and expensive. And with the dynamics of the financial institutions of capitalism, it's predatory capitalism. It ends up saddling students with debt for the rest of their lives. It's trapping students. And it's ridiculous that, for example, tuition here at NYU costs, total of $80,000 per year.
That's insane.
And of course, it's, for some who, through their connections, are going to go work in these corporations or hedge funds and whatnot, of course, they'll make all that back, and they didn't even have to take loans, but it reproduces the inequalities and ends up reproducing the injustice. But more importantly, also, this corporatization of higher education, I am old enough to have noticed even the change in the terminology and in the attitude. So students are dealt with as customers who are receiving the service, and so on and so forth. And even in some of their attitudes, a lot of the administrators are people who don't have experience teaching or are not actual scholars, but they make the most important decisions about how we run our universities. Same thing can be said about high school and junior high school, whereby the quality of public education in this country is going down, and it's the decaying of empire, I guess. But I should add that theoretically, university is supposed to be an open place for discussion and debate and learning, and asking questions and being critical. So the students of the encampments are actually embodying the positive aspects of academia. And the administrators and some of our cowardly colleagues all over the country and the world are displaying the antithesis of that, not standing up for truth, not supporting fellow colleagues, and not speaking up during a genocide. So just to give you an example about the maturity of these students, when after the first encampment was removed and the second encampment started, there were negotiations between student representatives and the administration. And the first demand of the students was that the professors who were fired be reinstated. So this tells you something about the sense of solidarity and community rather than just selfish interests.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting you mentioning the Reagan era, because that's when the kind of neoliberal privatization paradigm enters the United States, and I've heard other academics directly connect that to the student movement in the end of the 60s, essentially to defund the universities that were clearly such a big threat to the administration and to the military-industrial complex and the whole war movement. And I also, it strikes me that someone like the president of Colombia, Manouche Shafiq, that it's quite clear that she doesn't serve her students, she serves the donors, right? Because they're the ones that matter.
Yeah. I mean, that is the most egregious thing, is that the presidents and the provosts are answerable to people outside the university.
Yeah.
I mean, they always
talk about outside agitators,
Yeah. They always use the sense of community. And don't get me wrong, in all of the communications and the messages and the letters, the NYU community, the Columbia community, to such an extent that I had an allergy to that term. But in the last few months, this is when I truly felt a sense of community, as I said, is all the students and the professors coming together and supporting each other and volunteering their time and their efforts. And what do? They are calling the police against the community. And also, with the corporatization of higher education and turning students into customers, this whole notion of safety became so important and fetishized and used by universities. Yet, when did students at Columbia or NYU feel the most unsafe is because of a decision taken by the university to bring in the police.
Yeah, exactly.
And even, I should say, the second encampment at NYU was actually removed on that day, because on that day, there was a huge donor or their son were going to visit a building, and they didn't want to see, the encampments and whatnot. And even within the structures of the university, the colleges, it's the same thing. Where I work, the dean, and this is the meeting that we had right after the arrest of myself and 3 other colleagues, where there was no sense of support, and it's just top down, the narrative coming down from the administration to the others. So it's very alienating, and I think this is also what indirectly these encampments are doing, is to take back the university and hold on to some of its ideals that have been eroding for decades.
Yeah. Yeah, it brings us to the kind of the response from authorities in the United States, which has been, mostly terrifying, with often, like you said, Israeli-trained U.S. riot police violently breaking up encampments across the country, and in some cases, like in UCLA in Southern California, even firing rubber bullets into the crowd, which honestly, for me, reminded me of scenes that I saw in Cairo during the 2011 revolution. But the response is also just kind of like comically, it's just laughable. I mean, Joe Biden saying that peaceful protest is not allowed to disrupt society when the entire US is built on revolutionary actions like the Boston Tea Party, and this completely, Soviet-style pathetic use of an Oxford textbook on terrorism as evidence of terrorist activities. Sinan, what is this? You mentioned decaying empire. What is the state of the US empire? Is this a sign of it being weak?
Well, I just want to also say that this country is also built on settler colonialism and genocide and slavery. And I think, one aspect that doesn't come up as often as it should is that also that's why, those who believe in the ideology of settler colonialism in the United States are not cognizant of how the country came to be. They align with Israel and with Zionism because to be anti-Zionist and to critique Israel and what it has been doing means one has to also get rid of the national myth that they learn here.
Yeah.
But it is ferocious, but the state in this country has always responded with terror whenever there were movements such as these that question official policies. But I think what I think is that it's also a lot of Americans and others don't realize how militarized this country has been. And this country that keeps on waging wars and invasions and has since 2001 invaded and destroyed primarily Afghanistan and Iraq. And also after 9/11, this whole notion of the surveillance state has, penetrated every aspect of life. And we don't have time to go into how militarized even more so the police became. But if you ask a person of color or an African American, they'll tell you, this state terror basically has been going on from the beginning.
Yeah.
Now I think there is another aspect is that the demographics have changed in this country, and a lot of the students our students are persons of color and minorities and so on and so forth. But I think what terrifies the state is that there are also, it's a real spectrum. A lot of the white students are also part of this movement. And I think the danger is that it might become a social movement because Palestine is at the forefront now for obvious reason, but there is a whole set of demands that have to do with what kind of country this is and what kind of world we want to live in. But it is a decaying empire, and decaying empires are dangerous.
Yeah.
But I should just want to add that, the problem, one of the main problems, something that haunts me and has been haunting me for 30 years is, of course, how this world and its mainstream media and ideologies, of course, have a hierarchy of violence. Which types of violence are acceptable and legitimate and can be rationalized?
Yeah.
Oftentimes, of course, because who perpetrates them? And which types of violence were pre-programmed to reject them right away? And so what Joe Biden is saying, basically, then the civil rights movement in this country would not have happened.
Yeah.
These systems or any socio-political system does not improve automatically unless it's pushed and it's resisted. And not to be too dramatic, but so many of the benefits that we have as citizens were won by resistance and by protests.
Of course.
They were clinched from the system. The system does not give you rights because it's not a charity.
Of course, we would have nothing. We would not have universal suffrage. We wouldn't have Well, in this country, in Sweden, without disruptive protests, we wouldn't have guaranteed 5-week vacation. I know you don't have that in the United States, but you could maybe, if you keep doing encampments. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you as well.
But I also want to add, you keep saying Soviet and Soviet, not that I'm any, but we remember the McCarthyism in the United States,
Yeah,
and the witch hunt against anyone who was, thought to have communist sympathies and all of that. This happened here in this country.
yeah,
Didn't happen in the Soviet Union. People lost their livelihoods, their jobs.
yeah. You're absolutely right. Of course. I mean, and this feels very McCarthyism-ish. I mean, it feels like in the United States there's this button that people press, and then everyone turns into like a Spanish Inquisition informant or something.
The Red Scare.
The Red Scare, yeah. And now I guess it's a brown scare or something. But so you yourself, I mean, you mentioned Iraq as being one of these countries that has been destroyed by the United States. And this is where you're from, and you lived in the US during the invasion of Iraq, and I'm sure partook in and witnessed the quite large anti-war movement then, which was followed by the financial crisis and the very huge and significant Occupy Wall Street movement. How big, or what is your assessment of the significance of this current Gaza Solidarity encampment movement right now?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I was in Cairo when the invasion started. I had a fellowship there in Cairo.
Okay.
But before that, it was the announcement that the invasion of Iraq was imminent is when I was still a graduate student, when I started to speak up in public in English and write in English. And so definitely, retroactively, people forget or exaggerate the anti-war movement. So it's true. There was a huge demonstration in London, of course, one of the biggest. There were huge demonstrations in New York and on the West Coast. But more than half, at least, of the US citizenry was for the war.
Yeah.
And they continue to be for the invasion and for the war for years later. I just say this because of, every once in a while I write this essay about the anniversary of the war. So sadly, also, this is a predatory military culture. But I think the question was about what do I think of this movement, right? I think while those, movements had those slogans, of course, other slogans that are tied to war, because we know about the military-industrial complex and we know who benefits from war usually. But I think this movement comes after these other waves, and I think there is an accumulation of knowledge and of critical thinking, and there is also a sense of urgency. Now we know also what this system has done to the planet and how it's destroying our lives and the lives of other living beings. And this generation, unlike previous generations, is inheriting a world on fire. A world on fire and the elites don't seem to be taking any serious steps to change that. Also, this generation, the United States, unlike previous generations, cannot be guaranteed the promise of a middle-class life. That so-called American dream, which has, oftentimes been a nightmare for so many people, is no longer guaranteed. So I think there is this sense of urgency about what to do to save this world, really. And I'm not being poetic and I'm not being rhetorical. So that's what's the different from the previous movements and previous waves. Of course, Black Lives Matter was also about how the entire system of this country needs to be reimagined, everything in it, because it keeps reproducing injustice, it keeps reproducing inequality. And we saw that worldwide during the pandemic, whereby neither life nor death treat human beings equally. And where sadly, for a brief moment, we realized, allow me to say I knew already that the real heroes of this world are not the billionaires that are celebrated, but actually the people who make the world go on, the workers, the nurses, the doctors. But we've forgotten that again. So I think this is actually And that's why it's spreading across the world. It's similar also to the 1968 student revolt. It's a realization that another world is possible and that this world is not good. It's good for the privileged, it's good for a tiny percentage, but what type of world is this? I mean, imagine if someone comes from outer space and writes a report about this world, what would they say? A comprehensive report. If anyone needed proof, I think the way the world has allowed a full-fledged genocide that's documented to go on until today says that all of these institutions that we have, sometimes they produce good results, but if in 2024, after all of the accumulated knowledge of history and of past genocides and all of these conventions and all of these laws, if this world system cannot stop Israel from killing and maiming children, then this world needs to be changed so that it wouldn't happen again,
Yeah.
I mean, they made a mockery of never again.
Yeah, completely. Sinan, I'm going to let you go in just a second, but I just want to ask you a last question. Joe Biden has said that no matter what the students do, what demands they have, he's not going to change his policy vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine. What does that mean for the student encampment movement moving forward?
I mean, I think Joe Biden has dug his own political grave, even early on. But we know that he says that, he's a Zionist, so he shall reap the benefits of his Zionism.
Yeah.
If he's more committed to another country's national policies. And I am rarely optimistic. I'm always a pessimist, to use the word coined by Emil Habibi, the great Palestinian novelist. But I think that these students, I mean, unfortunately for the students and for us, is that semesters end in a week or two, and a lot of the students will go home, of course, or graduate and whatnot. But I think this will go on, even if there is a ceasefire, because the demands of the student movement are about liberating the universities from militarism and from links to the military-industrial complex. And there will be new students coming in, and capitalism will still be here, and the systematic support of Israel and of Zionism will still be here, and there will be continuity. I wrote on Twitter that these encampments are like wildflowers that will grow and come back, and I think it's true. As I remember when the Arab uprisings were hijacked or turned into civil wars by various regional and international forces, people thought that was the end. But it's a long struggle. It's not an event. It's resistance against a structure. So I think the encampments. Well, let's say the pro-Palestine movement will come back. It hasn't gone away, and I think in the fall. There will be resistance, there will be a more organized campaign to divest from Israel, because that's something that can be achieved. And we've seen how a couple of universities, reached agreements, Rutgers and Brown, and so on and so forth. So I'm trying to be optimistic and hopeful. So let's hope that if we meet again on the podcast, the movement will still be there in the fall.
Yeah, let's really hope for that, for sure. Sinan Antoon, thank you so much for speaking to us today at Kalam Podcast.
Thank you for hosting me. I'm delighted.
That was the Iraqi writer, poet, and scholar Sinan Antoon, and the 9th episode of Kalam. I hope you enjoyed it. Incidentally, Sinan was the translator for Ibtisam Azam's Book of Disappearance, which was featured in the 7th episode of Kalam. Please consider going back and listening to that if you haven't already. And while you're at it, why not listen to the full series on Palestine? I promise you, it'll be worth it. Until next week, that's it from us at the Kalam Podcast. Kalam was written and hosted by me, Edgar Mannheimer. Research and production by Sam Karl Samra. Poetry reading in Arabic by Khulud Saghir. And sound design by Arthur Mannheimer.